There was no warning when the veil tore, no prophecy, no sacred vision whispered by the Emperor's servants, no omen marked in blood or fire. It began as a vibration in the warp, a tremor that rippled through the currents of madness and malice that bound the galaxy together. Across 1,000 astropathic choirs, screams erupted as minds were overwhelmed by a sudden alien pressure. Demons paused mid-hunt, their shrieks fading into a silence of awe and confusion. The raw fabric of unreality convulsed, folding inward upon itself like the crushing of an ancient lung drawing a final, shuddering breath. Then came the rift. It burst into existence with a soundless detonation, a violent bloom of crimson light that swallowed stars. Warp storms flickered into being where once there had been void, their tendrils whipping across nearby systems. Fleets were hurled from their courses, ships vanishing into boiling seas of unreality. On a remote Imperial outpost orbiting the dead world of Varnus, Sensorium priests fell to their knees, blood streaming from their eyes as runes flared across their consoles. They had no words for what they saw, only prayers stammered through choking sobs. At the heart of this maelstrom, a shape began to take form. It emerged slowly at first, as if the warp itself resisted letting it pass. A silhouette, massive and hulking, limbs bound with tattered remnants of foreign armor, unlike anything catalogued by the Adeptus Mechanicus. The figure was wreathed in fire, but not the sacred flames of the ecclesiarchy or the bale fire of chaos. This was a primal, elemental blaze, white-hot and wrathful, that seemed to burn the very concept of existence. As the figure tumbled through the storm, chains clattered and broke apart, fragments dissolving into nothingness before they could touch the material realm. The first to see it clearly were not mortal at all, but demons. Beasts of the warp, formless and hungry, gathered to this intruder, sensing power that rivaled the dark gods themselves. They circled like carrion birds, whispering in languages older than time, their voices a cacophony of madness, and yet they did not attack. Something in the warrior's presence gave them pause. In this place where terror was currency and predation was law, the demons felt something they had not known since the earliest days of their existence. They felt fear. The figure struck the boundary of real space with the force of a falling star. The rift convulsed, reality screaming as it tried to reject the intruder. Planets trembled. Orbiting satellites shattered into clouds of molten slag. From the world below, the night sky bloomed with unnatural auroras of sickly green and pale violet. Millions of terrified souls looked upward and fell to their knees, some in prayer, others in gibbering madness. Kratos awoke to the smell of ash and iron. He lay upon cracked stone, his body half buried beneath the ruins of what had once been a mighty spire. The air was thick with smoke and the acrid tang of burning flesh. His chest rose and fell with heavy, deliberate breaths, as his senses returned. Pain thrummed through his muscles, not from weakness but from the violent tearing between realms. Slowly he pushed himself upright, the great chains wrapped around his forearms rattling softly. Their links were not the familiar ones he had known in his battles against gods and titans. These were strange, wrought from a metal that seemed almost alive, and even as he stared, they crumbled to dust. Kratos narrowed his eyes. This place was wrong. The sky above was not a sky at all, but a bruised expanse of blackness streaked with veins of red lightning. Towering structures rose from the horizon, alien and grotesque, their silhouettes twisted into baroque spires bristling with gargoyles and statues of stern, faceless beings. The distant thunder of explosions rolled across the land, mingled with the rhythmic pounding of mechanical engines. Somewhere beyond the haze, voices chanted in unison, deep guttural hymns filled with words that bore no meaning to him, yet radiated authority and menace. Kratos reached for the blades of chaos. The weapons materialized as if answering a silent command, their curved edges gleaming in the dim light. He felt the familiar hum of power within them, and allowed himself a single breath of certainty. Wherever he was, whatever gods or monsters ruled here, he was not without means to challenge them. Movement stirred at the edge of the ruins. Figures emerged from the smoke, ragged, emaciated humans wielding crude blades and rusted firearms. Their eyes glowed faintly with madness. They shouted to one another, in a harsh, guttural tongue, and though Kratos could not understand their words, the meaning was clear. They believed him prey. The first rushed forward with a scream. Kratos met him with a single contemptuous strike, the blade carving through flesh and bone as easily as air. The others hesitated for the barest instant before surging forward together. Chains whirled, blood sprayed in crimson arcs across the shattered stone. When the last body fell, Kratos stood alone once more, his chest heaving not with exhaustion but with a rising fury. He had known many worlds, many realms of gods and kings, yet none had felt as oppressive as this place. The very air seemed poisoned with despair, the land itself scarred by endless war. Kratos clenched his fists, staring at the distant towers. If this was another Olympus, another pantheon of tyrants, who fed upon the suffering of mortals, then he would do here as he had done before. He would tear it down. Far above, the rift shuddered one final time before collapsing inward, sealing itself with a thunderous silence. Across the galaxy, astropaths wept and screamed, their visions filled with a single image: a lone warrior, standing amidst a sea of corpses, his blades dripping with the blood of emperors and demons alike. In the hidden sanctums of the Inquisition, alarms blared, high lords turned pale. The words spoken by a trembling seer echoed through vaulted chambers, chilling even the most hardened zealots. "A god has fallen among us," she whispered, "and he is not our own." The ground trembled beneath Kratos' feet as he advanced through the smoldering ruins, his boots crunching over shattered stone and brittle bone. The sky above remained a wounded canvas of black and crimson, its unnatural hue casting a sickly pall over the land. Smoke coiled upward in choking plumes, carrying with it the bitter stench of charred flesh and promethium. Though the wind was cold, the air itself felt thick and oppressive, as though every breath were drawn through a veil of ash and despair. This place was not merely a battlefield, it was a graveyard for an entire world. Behind him, the corpses of the scavengers he had slain lay strewn like discarded refuse, their lifeless eyes staring in mute terror. Kratos spared them no glance. They had been obstacles, nothing more. What troubled him was not their attack, but the deeper question of where he had arrived, and why this realm felt so steeped in death. Even Olympus, at the height of its tyranny, had not radiated such suffocating decay. This was a world broken by endless war, its people hardened into either madmen or slaves. In the distance, the guttural chanting he had heard earlier grew louder, echoing through the ruins like the tolling of iron bells. The words were still alien to him, yet their tone carried unmistakable weight, ritualistic, fanatical. Kratos moved toward the sound, his muscles coiled, the blades of chaos held ready. The ruins gave way to a blasted plain littered with rusted metal, and the skeletal remains of war machines whose designs were utterly foreign. Some bore wings of blackened steel, others claws like mechanical beasts. All were long dead, their surfaces scarred by countless battles. This was not the aftermath of a single conflict, but the residue of centuries of unending carnage. As he crossed the plain, Kratos' sharp eyes caught movement on the horizon. A column of figures marched in ragged formation, their silhouettes flickering against the fires burning in the distance. These were no scavengers. Even at this distance, their bearing spoke of discipline and purpose. Heavy rifles were slung across their shoulders, and banners fluttered above their ranks, marked with a sigil of a double-headed bird cast in black and gold. Though Kratos knew nothing of the symbol, he felt the weight of its meaning. These were warriors bound by faith, and faith was often the chain that bound mortals most tightly. The column drew nearer, and for the first time, Kratos saw their faces. Men and women, pale and grim, their eyes sunken from exhaustion and hunger. Their armor was battered and ill-fitted, patchwork pieces scavenged from the dead. Yet there was a fire in their gazes, a fanatical gleam that reminded Kratos of the zealots he had once faced beneath the temples of Olympus. At their head marched a man in a coat of deep crimson, a tattered cloak trailing behind him. His chest bore a strange device that sputtered with static electricity, and he carried a weapon unlike any Kratos had seen, a staff topped with a snarling eagle of metal and flame. The warriors halted at the edge of the plain. For a moment, silence hung between the two forces. Then the crimson-clad leader stepped forward and barked a command. His voice was harsh, guttural and layered with authority. The soldiers around him leveled their rifles as one, the movement sharp and precise despite their weariness. The leader spoke again, gesturing at Kratos, his tone accusatory and filled with venom. Though Kratos could not understand the words, their intent was unmistakable. He was being judged. The soldiers fired. Thunder split the air as a storm of projectiles tore through the space Kratos had occupied a heartbeat before. He moved with preternatural speed, leaping sideways and rolling across the blackened soil. The blades of chaos flared to life in his hands, their edges glowing like molten fire. The second volley came, a hail of metal and smoke, but this time Kratos did not evade. He surged forward, his weapons spinning in a lethal arc that deflected the incoming rounds with sparks and shattering impacts. The nearest soldier barely had time to scream before the blade took his head cleanly from his shoulders. The battlefield dissolved into chaos. Kratos became a whirlwind of violence, his chains lashing, his roar echoing across the plain. The disciplined formation of the soldiers collapsed under the sheer ferocity of his assault. Limbs were severed, torsos cleaved apart, blood spraying in crimson fans that darkened the soil beneath their boots. Yet even as their comrades fell, the remaining soldiers did not flee. They fought with desperate courage, their chants rising above the clash of battle, their eyes blazing with fanatical resolve. The crimson-clad leader stood his ground, his staff crackling with arcs of lightning. He shouted a command, and a squad of his warriors unleashed a new kind of weapon, a searing beam of light that cut through the air like the breath of a god. It struck Kratos full in the chest, staggering him backward and scorching the skin beneath his armor. For the first time since his arrival, the Ghost of Sparta felt pain inflicted by this realm's weapons. His eyes narrowed, and a growl rumbled deep in his throat. With a bellow that shook the plain, Kratos hurled one of his blades directly at the weapon team. The chain unspooled with blinding speed, the curved edge punching through metal and bone alike. He yanked it back, dragging the bodies across the ground before slamming them into the ruins with bone-shattering force. The Crimson leader's defiance faltered for a heartbeat, and in that instant, Kratos closed the distance between them. The staff swung toward his head. Kratos caught it in one hand, snapping the weapon in half with a contemptuous twist. His other hand closed around the man's throat, lifting him into the air as though he weighed nothing. The leader kicked and struggled, shouting words that were equal parts command and prayer. Kratos said nothing. His gaze bored into the man's eyes, seeing the same mixture of faith and fear he had seen so many times before. With a final brutal motion, Kratos crushed his throat and cast the lifeless body aside. The surviving soldiers froze, their chants faltered. Then, one by one, they dropped their weapons and fell to their knees, pressing their foreheads to the blood-soaked soil. They began to chant anew, their voices trembling now not with defiance, but with awe. The words were still alien, but Kratos understood their meaning. They believed him a god. Kratos stared down at them, his breath heavy, his chest streaked with burns and blood. He had not sought worship, only survival. Yet as he looked upon these broken warriors, a memory stirred within him of temples built to false deities, of men enslaved by belief. This realm was no different. Its rulers, whoever they were, would be as corrupt and tyrannical as the gods he had slain before, and he would kill them all. Far away, aboard a drifting astropathic vessel, a psychic scream ripped through the void. Seers clutched their heads as visions flooded their minds, a world of black soil soaked in blood, a lone warrior standing above a pile of corpses, and the symbol of the double-headed bird burning in his hands. In the shadows of the Inquisition, one name was spoken with dread and disbelief. The kneeling soldiers trembled, their chanting rising and falling like the tide, broken by sobs and whispered prayers. The acrid smoke of battle clung to the air, mingling with the metallic tang of blood that seeped into the cracked soil beneath them. Kratos stood among them, silent and immovable, his chest rising with deep, deliberate breaths. His blades hung at his sides, their edges still glowing faintly from the heat of slaughter. These men and women feared him utterly, yet their fear had already begun to change into something else. They were no longer enemies, they were supplicants. One among them, a grizzled soldier with a half-shattered helm, raised his head,
His eyes were wild, but there was clarity beneath the madness. He pressed his palm to the broken emblem on his chest plate and spoke a single word, his voice hoarse, but reverent. Though Kratos did not understand the tongue, he understood its shape. The man was naming him, declaring him divine. Others echoed the name, louder this time, until it became a rhythmic chant. Fists pounded against armor, banners were lifted from the blood-soaked ground, their black and gold sigils quivering in the heated air. The devotion of these mortals burned like kindling, swift and fierce, but Kratos had seen the dangers of such fires before. He had been worshipped once, long ago, and it had brought ruin to all. The memory of temples burning and statues shattering under his own hands flashed before his eyes, hardening his expression. He turned from them without a word, striding toward the distant spires that marked the heart of this desolate city. His purpose was not to rule these mortals, but to uncover the truth of this realm. Yet the soldiers followed anyway, limping and staggering, wounded but unbroken. Their voices carried on the wind, their chants swelling as they marched behind the warrior who had slaughtered their leader and crushed their enemies in a single unstoppable charge. As they advanced, Kratos took in the ruins more carefully. The city was ancient, its structures impossibly vast, carved with stern visages and towering arches that seemed designed to dwarf the mortals who walked beneath them. Statues of armored giants lined the streets, their stone faces blank and pitiless. Entire buildings were fashioned into cathedrals, their shattered windows depicting scenes of endless war and sacrifice. It was a realm built not merely for survival, but for worship. Everywhere he looked, the symbol of the double-headed bird stared back at him, etched into walls, burned into banners, and painted across the armor of the dead. The faithful had built their entire world upon reverence for this icon, and fear of whatever power it represented. Kratos slowed as the chanting behind him faltered. The column of survivors had halted, their faces pale, their eyes flicking nervously toward a nearby street. The silence that followed was heavy and unnatural. Kratos turned his head, sensing from the shadows ahead, more figures emerged, but these were not broken, starving mortals. These were soldiers of a different breed. Their armor was uniform and immaculate, their movements precise. Each bore a rifle of complex design, its barrel glowing faint. Their helms were sealed, their visors blank and impassive, and unlike the ragged faithful behind him, these warriors did not kneel. A single word was barked in a sharp, commanding tone. The disciplined squad spread out, rifles snapping to aim in a perfect line. Behind them, the battered faithful fell to their knees once more, pressing their foreheads to the ground. They were whispering prayers now, trembling with a mix of reverence and terror. Kratos glanced between the kneeling mortals and the advancing soldiers, and understood. These were two faces of the same empire. The kneeling ones were its flock, the armed ones were its shepherds and executioners.
The lead soldier stepped forward and raised a hand. His voice came through a vox amplifier, cold and metallic, filled with authority. Though Kratos could not understand the words, he understood the intent: surrender, submission. Kratos' jaw tightened. Submission was a language he had long since rejected. When he did not comply, the soldier gestured sharply. The rifles fired in perfect unison, the sound a rolling thunderclap that echoed through the ruins. Kratos moved instantly, his body a blur of motion. The first volley tore past him, shattering statues and kicking up plumes of dust and debris. With a roar he surged forward, blades spinning, deflecting rounds and severing rifle barrels as he closed the distance. The disciplined line held firm, its members fighting without hesitation or fear. But against Kratos, their precision became meaningless. He crashed into their formation like a storm breaking a wall, tearing through them with savage efficiency. Armor split beneath his strikes, and bodies crumpled beneath his fists. The clash of flesh, metal and divine fury drowned out even the screams of the faithful. Behind him, the kneeling survivors watched in awe and terror. Some began to weep openly, crying out prayers to the figure who fought alone against their former master. A few, driven by desperation and newfound zeal, seized fallen rifles and joined the fray, turning their weapons against the soldiers they once served. Their inaccurate fire mattered little, but their defiance marked a shift in the air. When the last soldier fell, the silence that followed was profound. The battlefield was a charnel ground, littered with shattered bodies and pools of dark blood. Kratos stood in the midst of it, chest heaving, his skin streaked with soot and gore. He turned slowly, his gaze falling upon the trembling faithful. They met his eyes with unblinking reverence. No one fled, no one dared to speak. Kratos began to understand the structure of this realm. These mortals were ruled through worship and terror, their lives dictated by those who claimed divine authority. It was an empire built upon chains, chains of faith, chains of law, chains of fear, and now, in their eyes, he was another link in that chain. He had killed their masters. By their logic, that made him worthy of worship. The thought was bitter in his mind. He did not want their devotion, yet he could not deny its usefulness. These mortals knew the land, the rulers, the enemies hidden in the shadow. Through them he might find the heart of this empire and rip it free. As he prepared to speak, a sudden tremor rippled through the earth. The faithful gasped, some collapsing entirely, clutching their heads in pain. Above, the sky writhed like a living thing, as a distant roar echoed across the horizon. It was not the sound of beasts or machines, but something deeper, a psychic howl that gnawed at the very soul. Kratos' grip tightened on his blades. Whatever force ruled this realm had sensed his presence, and it was coming. The tremor that rippled beneath Kratos' feet did not subside. It spread outward in waves, shaking the ground like the heartbeat of some colossal buried beast. The faithful dropped to their knees, clutching their heads, and wailing as if an unseen hand were clawing at their minds. The air grew heavy and sour, thick with an invisible presence that Kratos could not name but felt deep in his bones. It was not mere sound or movement, it was a pressure, an intrusion, like a blade pressing against the edge of his thoughts. The sky split with a jagged vein of violet lightning. For an instant, Kratos glimpsed shapes writhing within the storm clouds, forms too vast and shifting to belong to any mortal creature. Their outlines shimmered and broke apart, reforming into grotesque visages that seemed to leer directly at him. Whispers rose on the wind, guttural and discordant, overlapping voices that spoke in 1,000 tongues. Though the words were meaningless to him, their intent was clear: hunger, curiosity, and malice, woven together into one. Kratos' grip tightened on the blades of chaos. He had faced gods, titans and monsters born of divine spite, but this was different. These whispers carried no single will. They were not one enemy, but many, fractured pieces of an intelligence that existed beyond understanding. His rage flared instinctively, a shield against the intrusion. He would not bow to unseen forces. Behind him, the faithful convulsed on the ground. Blood streamed from their noses and ears as their voices joined the chorus of whispers, echoing words they did not comprehend. Their eyes rolled back, white and sightless, as if another power were speaking through them. One woman, her limbs trembling violently, rose unsteadily to her feet. Her voice was no longer her own. It was deep and resonant, layered with a sound like the grinding of ancient stone. "A storm comes," she intoned, her blank gaze fixed on Kratos. "The veil is thin, and it screams for you, outsider. The gods of this realm have seen you. They hunger for your blood, or your worship." Kratos strode toward her, cutting through the crowd of kneeling mortals. "I worship no gods," he growled, his voice a low rumble beneath the howling wind. "Tell them this." Before he could reach her, her body seized violently. A sickening crack echoed as her spine bent backward at an impossible angle, and a moment later, she collapsed lifelessly into the dirt. The faithful wailed in terror, scattering away from her corpse. Their cries mingled with the rising storm, as the whispers swelled to a deafening roar. Far above, unseen by mortal eyes, ripples in the Imperium spread outward from this place, like rings on black water. Across the sector, astropathic choirs shuddered, and broke beneath the psychic weight of it. In the cathedral fortresses of the ecclesiarchy, saints wept tears of blood, as visions flooded their minds, visions of a warrior, wreathed in fire, standing atop a mountain of broken thrones. Deep within the vaulted halls of an inquisitorial stronghold,
Alarms wailed. Robed figures gathered around a flickering hololithic map, their faces pale and drawn. The eldest among them, an inquisitor, whose bionic eyes gleamed with cold precision, studied the spreading disturbance with grim fascination. His aides spoke rapidly, their voices filled with fear. "It is like nothing we have encountered before, Lord. The warp signatures are inconsistent. They shift between readings, one moment like a daemon prince, the next like something entirely alien." The Inquisitor's mechanical fingers drummed against the table. "Whatever it is, it has the attention of the warp itself. Summon every resource we have. I want fleets mobilized and a kill team dispatched immediately. If this entity is of chaos, we will destroy it. If it is something new," his voice dropped to a whisper, "we will control it." Even as his orders spread through the Imperium's communication networks, chaos itself stirred. In the Imperium, daemons shrieked in glee or terror, as the rift's resonance called to them. Warbands of heretics and traitor legions felt the pulse in their dreams, and turned their ships toward the source. Among them, a sorcerer of the Thousand Suns sat cross-legged in the heart of a blasphemous shrine, his third eye opening to gaze into the storm. He saw a lone figure standing amidst ruin, his presence a wound upon the fabric of both realms. The sorcerer's lips curved into a smile. "Not a daemon, not a man," he murmured. "A weapon the galaxy has not yet named." Back on the ruined world, Kratos advanced through the desolate streets, ignoring the terrified whispers of the faithful trailing behind him. The psychic storm pressed closer with each step, clawing at his mind. Images flickered in the corners of his vision, visions not of his memories, but of horrors foreign to him. A city of iron and fire, its towers crumbling into a sea of screaming faces. A throne of gold upon which sat a desiccated corpse, its empty sockets glowing with faint, cruel light. Armies of armored giants clashing beneath banners of flame and bone. Kratos snarled and shook his head, banishing the visions. He had been manipulated by gods before. Their illusions would not rule him now. The path led him to a vast plaza at the city's center. Here the ground was scorched and cracked, the remnants of a great battle etched into every stone. At its heart stood a massive statue of a winged figure, its features worn and faceless, its hands outstretched as if to embrace, or to strangle. Around the statue lay hundreds of bodies, some ancient and skeletal, others freshly slain. Many bore symbols that Kratos recognized from the soldiers he had fought earlier. The double-headed bird, fractured and defaced. The whispers grew louder, rising to a fever pitch. Kratos's vision blurred, the air thickening until it seemed to pulse like living flesh. From the shadows between the shattered statues, shapes began to emerge. They were not solid, but half-formed, their outlines shifting between flesh and smoke. They hissed and chattered, their voices a chorus of insanity. The faithful fell to the ground, screaming prayers to their unseen emperor. Kratos bared his teeth, his blades igniting with a burst of fiery light. These creatures were no different from the monsters he had slain in his own world. Their forms were strange, their voices alien, but their intent was the same: to consume, to destroy, to rule through terror. The first daemon lunged, its claws like serrated knives. Kratos met it head-on, cleaving through its body with a single strike. The creature dissolved into smoke and shrieks, but another took its place, then another. Soon the plaza was a storm of writhing forms and flashing blades, the air thick with the stench of burning edge. Kratos fought without pause, his movements precise and brutal, each kill a declaration of defiance. As the last daemon fell, the whispers receded slightly, though they never vanished completely. The faithful rose shakily, their eyes filled with awe and terror. Kratos stood among the smoking remains of his foes, chest heaving, his mind already turning toward the next battle. Somewhere beyond this city, beyond this world, the true masters of this realm were watching him, and in their watching they were afraid. The silence that followed the battle was not peace, but exhaustion, heavy and trembling. The faithful huddled together at the edges of the plaza, whispering prayers through cracked lips, their voices hoarse from scream. Smoke rose from the piles of smoldering daemon flesh, a stench so foul it seemed to cling to the very soul. Kratos stood at the center, surrounded by ruin and death, his blades dripping with the black ichor of the creatures he had destroyed. His chest rose and fell with controlled breaths, his gaze fixed on the distant spires where the storm clouds gathered like a closing fist. The whispers of the warp had receded, but their echoes still lingered in his mind, like faint scratches on stone. They had spoken of hunger, of watching eyes, of gods that demanded kneeling. Kratos had knelt once before in his life, and had sworn never to do so again. This world, with its tyrants cloaked in divinity, would be no different. Yet even as he prepared to strike against it, he knew he would need to understand it first. The chains that bound these mortals were not merely iron and steel, but faith and fear woven into their very existence. To break them, he would need to see where they began.
A distant rumble grew steadily louder, deep and rhythmic, like the heartbeat of a great machine. The faithful froze, terror flashing across their dirt-streaked faces. Some fell prostrate, others fled into the ruins, wailing prayers to an unseen emperor. Kratos turned toward the sound, muscles tensing. Massive silhouettes emerged from the mist, towering war machines of blackened metal, their forms bristling with weapons. At their feet marched ranks of soldiers clad in pristine armor, their banners glowing with the hated symbol of the double-headed bird. This was no scattered patrol, it was an army. The leader rode at the forefront atop a hulking tracked platform. His armor was ornate, encrusted with relics and purity seals that fluttered in the ash-choked wind. His helm bore a golden crest, and in his gauntleted hands he carried a weapon like a burning spear. His voice boomed through a vox amplifier, incomprehensible yet dripping with authority. Though Kratos could not understand the words, their meaning was clear enough. Surrender, submit or be destroyed. Kratos snarled. Before he could act, a strange pressure wrapped around him, invisible and suffocating. His limbs locked in place as though bound by unseen chains. A psychic force, alien yet precise, pressed against his will, seeking to crush his defiance. The faithful screamed and scattered as the Imperium soldiers advanced, their rifles raised, their formation perfect. Kratos strained against the invisible bonds, every muscle trembling with effort. His roar split the air, echoing like thunder across the plaza. For an instant, the chains faltered, but then they tightened, dragging him to his knees. A figure stepped forward from the rear of the formation, clad in robes of deep crimson trimmed with gold. His face was hidden behind a mask of etched steel, and in his hands he held a staff crowned with a floating sigil of glowing light. This one did not speak aloud. His thoughts pressed directly into Kratos' mind, cold and sharp as a blade. The words were not exact, but their shape was clear enough for Kratos to understand. You are a weapon we do not know. You will be taken. You will serve. Kratos bared his teeth, his voice a growl of pure defiance. I serve no master. The Psyker's mental grip tightened, crushing down like a vice. Pain flared behind Kratos' eyes, threatening to tear his mind apart. Around him, the soldiers closed in, their formation encircling him entirely. Chains of real steel now followed the unseen ones, heavy manacles clamped around his wrists and ankles. The blades of chaos were wrenched from his hands and carried away by trembling mortals who dared not meet his gaze. As they dragged him toward a waiting transport, Kratos caught a glimpse of the faithful who had followed him. They knelt in the dirt, weeping, their chants rising once more. To them, he was still a god, but a god now captured, bound by enemies too mighty to resist. Their cries were not of betrayal but of sorrow, prayers for his return. Kratos turned his head away. He had no time for their worship, only vengeance. The transport was a coffin of iron, its walls etched with runes and wards meant to contain daemons. Even so, the soldiers surrounding him treated him as if he were something worse. The journey through the city was marked by silence, save for the rumble of engines and the distant wail of sirens. Outside, through narrow slits, Kratos glimpsed the sprawl of the Imperium's dominion, endless factories belching black smoke, cathedral fortresses where masses of mortals knelt in rigid lines, colossal statues that cast their shadows across entire districts. This was no simple empire. It was a machine that devoured worlds, and its cogs were mortals who worshipped their own chains. The transport finally came to rest inside a cavernous structure of cold metal and sanctified stone. The air here was colder, filled with the metallic scent of blood and incense. The soldiers moved with mechanical precision, hauling Kratos into a chamber lined with restraints and strange machinery. At its center loomed a dark throne, its surface covered with glowing sigils and archaic devices. Upon it sat a figure whose presence filled the room like a physical weight. His armor was black as night, trimmed with gold, his helm shaped like a skull. An inquisitor, Kratos did not know the title, but he recognized the essence, a ruler cloaked in righteousness, the kind of tyrant who declared his will divine. The inquisitor rose slowly, his voice calm yet edged with steel. Through the Psyker's translation, Kratos understood fragments of his speech. Words like weapon, heresy, obedience. Chains tightened around Kratos' limbs, biting into his flesh. The Psyker's presence pressed into his mind again, colder this time, seeking to bend his will. Images flooded his thoughts, images of worlds burning, of mortals kneeling before golden thrones, of endless war fought in the name of a god who was never seen. Kratos closed his eyes, and then, with a roar born of defiance and rage, he shattered the psychic chains. The chamber erupted in chaos as the bindings snapped like brittle twigs. Soldiers were hurled aside, the Psyker's scream cut short as Kratos seized his staff and broke it across his knee. The Inquisitor drew a massive weapon, a blade wreathed in crackling energy, but even he hesitated for the briefest instant. Kratos stepped forward, his voice a promise of destruction. No more chains, and with that, the slaughter began. The chamber was a storm of violence. The moment Kratos shattered the psychic chains, chaos erupted like a dam bursting. Soldiers fired wildly, their disciplined formations crumbling as their comrades were flung across the stone walls by the sheer force of his fury. The Psyker lay broken at his feet, his mask shattered, lifeless eyes staring into nothing. The Inquisitor roared commands, his voice amplified by the vox built into his armor, but fear bled through even his iron control. Kratos advanced, each step shaking the ground, his blades cutting through gunfire and flesh alike. The Inquisitor swung his power sword with deadly precision, the blade humming with energy that scorched the air. Sparks flared as it clashed with the blades of chaos, a clash of ancient weaponry against the Imperium's finest. Kratos snarled, pressing forward, his muscles straining as he forced the Inquisitor back step by step. The clash was brief but brutal. With a sudden twist, Kratos wrenched the weapon from the man's grasp and drove his fist into his armored chest. The impact cracked ceramite like brittle bone, sending the Inquisitor sprawling across the floor. Before Kratos could finish him, a klaxon blared, loud enough to shake the chamber. Harsh red light bathed the walls as vox speakers erupted with frantic warnings. The words meant nothing to Kratos, but their urgency was unmistakable. A deep tremor rattled the entire structure, followed by a guttural roar that reverberated through the metal beneath his feet. The soldiers' panicked shouts shifted, their eyes no longer fixed solely on Kratos, but on something far worse. The Inquisitor coughed, blood seeping through his broken breastplate, his gaze, filled with pain and fury, locked on Kratos. Through clenched teeth, he spat out a single broken word in a language even Kratos could understand. Tyranids. Kratos turned sharply as a distant explosion tore through the structure. The walls quaked, a shower of dust and debris raining down from above. Somewhere deeper within the facility, the sound of tearing metal and alien shrieks mingled with human screams. The soldiers who had moments ago been prepared to die fighting Kratos now fled past him, their discipline dissolving into pure survival instinct. The Inquisitor staggered to his feet, clutching his side. "You have brought ruin upon us all, creature," he snarled, his voice hoarse and ragged. "You will not survive what comes." Kratos did not answer. He needed no explanation for what he heard approaching. He had fought countless beasts, but this sound was different. It was not the cry of one predator, but of many, a swarm moving as one, an army with a single ravenous will. The stench of alien musk and acid filled the air as the first creature burst through the far wall in a shower of stone and metal. It was a nightmare given flesh, its body a grotesque blend of chitin, muscle and claw. Its eyeless head swiveled,
tasting the air with quivering tendrils before letting out a scream that vibrated through Kratos' skull. More followed, pouring through the breach in an unstoppable tide. Their talons ripped through fleeing soldiers, their bodies scythed apart in seconds. Bolt of fire erupted from the defenders who had managed to rally, but the swarm barely slowed, its hunger driving it ever forward. Kratos leapt into the fray with a roar. His blades ignited in arcs of fire, cutting through chitinous armor and severing limbs with every strike. The creatures were fast, but he was faster, weaving between their strikes and driving them back through sheer force of will. A massive beast lunged, its claws like hooked scythes, but Kratos caught its limbs in his hands and tore them apart in a spray of He drove his blade into its skull, splitting it open before hurling the carcass into the swarm behind it. The remaining soldiers fought beside him now, their earlier enmity forgotten in the face of annihilation. Their shouts mingled with the roar of bolters and the screeching of the Tyrannic. Even the Inquisitor, wounded and staggering, wielded a fallen rifle, firing with grim precision. But for every alien they killed, 3 more took its place. The chamber became a slaughterhouse, its stone floors slick with blood both human and alien. Kratos fought at the center, an unyielding whirlwind of destruction. The swarm began to focus on him, sensing the greatest threat. Dozens leapt upon him at once, clawing and biting, their combined weight threatening to drag him down. With a furious bellow, Kratos unleashed his full strength. His chains spun outward in a blazing arc, cleaving through the horde in a single, devastating sweep. Limbs and ichor rained down as he broke free, standing amidst a circle of twitching corpses. The survivors seized the moment. "Fall back!" the Inquisitor shouted, his voice ragged, but commanding. To the transport bay. The soldiers fled, dragging the wounded with them. Kratos remained where he stood, staring down the endless tide still pouring through the breach. There was no victory here, only escape or death. With a final glance at the oncoming swarm, he turned and followed the retreating humans. The corridors of the facility were chaos. Sirens wailed, fires raged, and terrified mortals trampled one another in their desperation to flee. Kratos carved a path through both man and monster, his fury unrelenting. Behind him, the Tyranids consumed everything in their path, their numbers swelling as smaller creatures swarmed through vents and shattered walls. At last, they reached the hangar, a vast chamber filled with waiting transports. The Inquisitor barked orders, and the remaining soldiers poured into the nearest vessel. Kratos hesitated, his instincts screaming against being caged again. But as a monstrous screech shook the hangar, he saw the walls buckling beneath the assault. There was no other path. With a snarl he leapt aboard. The hatch sealed just as the swarm broke through, claws raking against the hull. The engines roared to life, lifting the vessel skyward. Through a narrow viewport, Kratos watched the facility below vanish beneath a tide of writhing alien flesh. The Inquisitor collapsed into a seat, his breath ragged. His gaze found Kratos once more, filled with equal parts hatred and awe. "This was your trial, creature," he rasped. "Survive the Tyranids, and perhaps you may yet serve." Kratos said nothing. He turned away, his jaw clenched as the ship ascended into the choking clouds. Behind them, the world burned, and ahead lay only more war. The transport tore through the upper atmosphere, its hull rattling beneath the strain of ascent. The stench of smoke and blood still clung to its interior, mingling with the acrid tang of burned circuitry. The surviving soldiers huddled together in silence, their armor scorched and battered, their eyes hollow from what they had just endured. The rhythmic thrum of the engines was broken only by the occasional distant screech of the Tyranids far below, their cries fading as the world beneath was consumed. Kratos stood apart from them, silent and unmoved. His great frame filled the narrow space, the chains coiled around his forearms glimmering faintly in the low light. He did not sit, did not rest. His hands were still slick with alien ichor, and his breath came slow and steady, though his muscles hummed with the residual heat of battle. He stared out through a narrow viewport, watching the ashen clouds fall away to reveal the void beyond, a vast cold expanse dotted with distant stars. It was a sky unlike any he had ever known, yet it felt no more infinite than the chaos within his own mind. The Inquisitor sat slumped nearby, clutching his side where Kratos had shattered his armor. His breath rattled through broken vox grills, but his eyes remained sharp and filled with venomous will. He spoke quietly to his remaining aides, their words sharp and clipped, but Kratos paid them little attention. The meaning was plain enough. They plotted his fate even now. Whether they called him prisoner, weapon or heretic, the chains they imagined for him were no less real than the ones he had already broken. As the transport rose higher, a low hum filled the cabin. The soldiers stiffened, exchanging uneasy glances. Through the viewport, a massive silhouette emerged from the darkness. It was a starship, colossal beyond comprehension, its surface bristling with gun batteries and cathedral-like spires. Its hull gleamed with symbols of faith and war, its sheer size enough to dwarf entire city. Kratos narrowed his eyes. It was not a vessel built merely to travel, it was a moving fortress, a temple forged for conquest. The transport docked with a thunderous clang. Hatches hissed open, releasing gouts of mist into the corridor beyond. Armed guards in immaculate armor stood waiting, their weapons raised, their stances rigid. They surrounded the battered survivors and their strange prize. The Inquisitor barked orders, his voice raw but commanding, and the soldiers obeyed without hesitation. Kratos was encircled by a dozen of them, their rifles never wavering as they marched him through the vessel's labyrinthine halls. The air aboard the ship was cold and sharp, laced with incense and machine oil. The walls were covered in reliefs depicting scenes of eternal war, armored giants battling horned daemons, winged figures, smiting heretics, mortals kneeling in endless lines before a distant unseen throne. Everywhere he looked, Kratos saw symbols of worship, carved into the very bones of the vessel. It was a moving shrine to an unseen god, a god whose worshippers wielded weapons of fire and steel. They brought him to a vast chamber at the heart of the ship. There, suspended in midair, hovered a golden reliquary surrounded by hooded figures chanting in unison. The Inquisitor stepped forward and gestured to Kratos, his tone both triumphant and reverent. The robed figures raised their voices higher, their hands weaving intricate sigils in the air. Kratos felt the pressure before he understood it. An invisible weight settled upon him, heavy and suffocating. It was not like the psychic chains from before. This was different, colder, sharper, like hooks sinking into his very soul. Visions flickered before his eyes, endless battlefields, burning worlds, the double-headed bird rising above oceans of blood. At the center of it all sat a figure on a throne of gold, its face hidden in shadow, its gaze searing through time itself. The voices of the chanters merged into a single booming word that echoed inside his skull. He did not know the language, but he knew its meaning. Submission. Kratos roared in defiance. The sound shattered the chant, sending echoes crashing through the chamber. The psychic hooks tore free as he wrenched himself from their grasp. The golden reliquary, trembling from the force of his rejection. Guards rushed forward, but they were too slow. The blades of chaos leapt to his hands, their fiery chains igniting in a burst of molten light. The first ranks fell instantly, their bodies cleaved apart, before their weapons could fire. Kratos moved like a storm unleashed, cutting through man and machine with unstoppable fury. The chanting ceased. Screams filled the air. Blood slicked the sacred floors, mingling with spilled incense and shattered relics. The Inquisitor stood at the far end of the chamber, his expression hidden behind his helm. He raised his broken power sword, its blade sparking erratically, and shouted orders above the din. More troops poured into the chamber, their rifles roaring. Kratos deflected their fire with spinning chains, closing the distance in a blur of motion. He struck the Inquisitor down with a single brutal blow that shattered his helm and silenced his commands forever. The surviving soldiers faltered, some dropped their weapons, others fled entirely, and in the silence that followed, the ship itself seemed to hold its breath. Then came the whispers, not the quiet murmurs of the warp he had heard before, but voices carried through the walls, the decks, the very metal of the vessel. They were not human, they were not of this world. They spoke in the minds of every living being aboard, and though their words were alien, Their message was unmistakable: fear and awe. For the being, who had defied both the Imperium and the Swarm, Kratos stood alone in the blood-soaked chamber, surrounded by the dead and the dying. The mortals, who remained, began to kneel, their voices trembling as they called him by a name he did not know, a name that spread through the corridors like fire through dry grass. Somewhere in the ship's lower decks, that name became a chant, from a chant, a hymn, from a hymn, a promise. The faithful had found a new god, not one of distant thrones or empty statues, but a god who fought alone, who slew kings and daemons with his own hands. Kratos turned his gaze to the void beyond the viewport. The galaxy stretched before him, endless and broken. The thrones of this realm would not fall on their own. If they would make him a god, then he would show them what kind of god he truly was. The great ship drifted through the void, like a wounded beast, its once glorious spires blackened by fire and splattered with blood. The hymn to Kratos spread through its corridors, a living current flowing from deck to deck. At first, it was a whisper among the lower crew, a desperate plea, uttered by those who had seen him strike down daemons and defy the Imperium. Then, it grew, carried by lips cracked with hunger and eyes hollowed by fear, until the entire vessel trembled with the sound of thousands chanting his name. To them, he was salvation made flesh. To Kratos, their worship was a bitter echo of the past. He stood at the prow of the ship, staring into the cold stars beyond the viewport. His hands tightened around the chains coiled at his forearms. This galaxy was vast, endless in its reach, yet bound by the same rot he had seen in his own world. Temples built to hollow gods, thrones raised above oceans of suffering, mortals kneeling until they forgot how to stand. Only the weapons had changed, only the scale. The voices that now praised him would one day seek to bind him, just as Olympus had once tried to shackle his will. He would not allow it. The door behind him hissed open. A single figure approached cautiously, bowing his head. He was not a soldier, but a crewman, his simple robes torn and his face gaunt. He spoke in the guttural tongue of this realm, gesturing urgently toward the lower decks. Kratos did not understand the words, but the fear was clear. There was unrest, mutiny, perhaps, or resistance among those who still clung to the Imperium's decrees. The mortals' eyes pleaded with him, for judgment, for the intervention of the god they now followed. Kratos said nothing. He strode past the man descending through the decks, like a shadow descending into the underworld. The further down he went, the more signs of chaos he saw. Fires burned in the corridors, blood streaked the wall. Rival factions of crew and soldiers fought in the narrow spaces, their battle cries mingling with prayers and curses. Those loyal to the Imperium shouted oaths to their distant emperor, while others screamed Kratos' name as they charged with scavenged blades and makeshift shields. When they saw him emerge, both sides faltered. Silence spread like a wave. The fighting ceased, weapons lowered, voices trembling. Kratos looked upon them, his face hard and unreadable. He did not raise his blades. He simply turned and walked onward. Those who opposed him fled into the shadows, unwilling to test the wrath they had witnessed. Those who followed fell to their knees, bowing their heads so low they nearly touched the blood-soaked deck. The path ended at a vast chamber deep in the belly of the ship. Here lay the true heart of its power, a command throne wrought of steel and gold, its arms bristling with interfaces and conduits. Incense burned in the corners, mixing with the stink of oil and death. The corpse of the Inquisitor had been dragged here by the faithful and left at the foot of the throne as an offering. His shattered helm lay beside him, a symbol of the old order cast down. Kratos approached the throne slowly, his boots echoing on the metal floor. The crowd gathered around him, their breaths held, their eyes wide with expectation. They awaited a gesture, a word, a sign that he would claim what they had built for him. He stared at the throne, and memories surged unbidden. The throne of Olympus, glittering and cold, where gods had plotted the ruin of men. The throne of Ares, stained with blood, the empty thrones he had toppled one by one, until none remained but his own fury. He reached out, placing a hand on the armrest. The machine hummed beneath his touch, lights flickering to life, as if recognizing a new master. A cheer rose from the faithful, their voices rising in unison, until the chamber shook with their devotion. Yet Kratos felt no triumph. The throne was a trap, no different than the chains he had shattered. To sit upon it would be to accept the same cycle he had destroyed in his own realm. It would mean ruling through fear, as the Imperium did. That path would not break this galaxy, it would only remake it in another tyrant's image. With a roar that silenced the crowd, Kratos gripped the throne's armrests and wrenched them free. Metal screamed as he tore the seat apart, reducing it to a heap of broken fragments. Gasps and cries filled the chamber. The faithful stared in shock, their certainty shattered. Some wept, others raged, but none dared to move against him. Kratos raised his voice, and though they could not understand his words, the meaning was carved into every syllable. He pointed to the wreckage at his feet, then to the sky beyond the viewport. His message was clear: no thrones, no masters, no distant rulers to command their lives. If they followed him, they would fight not to serve another empire but to destroy all empires. Slowly, the fear in their faces gave way to something new. A flame of defiance flickered in their eyes, fragile but growing. One by one, they began to chant again. This time, it was not worship, it was a battle cry, a promise of war. Above them, alarms blared. The ship's Auspex systems had detected incoming vessels, Imperial reinforcements drawn by the destruction Kratos had wrought. The faithful looked to him in panic, but he did not waver. This was the moment he had awaited, to test the strength of this galaxy's rulers, to tear down their first barrier, and see how many lay beyond. He raised his blades, their fire illuminating the chamber, like the wrath of an ancient god. Let them come, he growled. The faithful roared in answer. The vessel shifted as its engines thundered to life. Fighters launched from its bays, crude weapons hastily armed, all aimed at the approaching fleet. Kratos stood at the center of it all, unshaken by the storm to come. As the first Imperial warships broke through the void and opened fire, Kratos felt no fear. This was not merely a battle, it was the beginning of a crusade, one that would leave only ashes where thrones once stood. The void ignited with fire. The Imperial fleet descended like a storm of iron, their vessels emerging from the warp in a blaze of holy light and burning engines. Each ship bore the mark of the double-headed bird, their colossal hulls etched with scriptures and purity sealed. Their vox horns blared, hymns of vengeance, as they closed in on the heretical craft now under Kratos's command. To the Imperium, this was not a simple engagement, it was a purge, a sacred extermination of a threat that defied both faith and reason. The first salvo struck with the fury of a god's hammer. Lances of light pierced the void, slamming into the vessel's shields. Entire sections of the hull shuddered and collapsed, air venting in violent gouts of steam and debris. Crew and faithful were hurled, screaming into the cold abyss. Kratos stood unmoved on the command deck, his silhouette framed by the viewport as explosions blossomed around him. The mortals clutched at control panels and shouted frantically in their guttural tongue, but he heard only the rhythm of war, the steady pounding of battle drums that had followed him across worlds. Another impact shook the deck. The vessel's alarms wailed, crimson light flashing across the chamber. The faithful looked to Kratos, their eyes wide with desperation. Though they did not share his language, their meaning was clear. They were losing. Kratos did not speak. He raised his blades, and their fiery glow filled the chamber. The sight alone was enough to calm the terrified crew. They straightened, their chants rising once more, not in worship but in defiance. Under his silent command, they turned the ship to face the enemy head-on. Crude weapons roared to life, spewing missiles and macro-cannon fire into the approaching fleet. The void became a maelstrom of fire and shrapnel, But the Imperium's forces were unrelenting. Sleek strike cruisers broke through the chaos, disgorging smaller craft like swarms of metallic locusts. Boarding torpedoes slammed into Kratos's vessel, their hulls glowing red-hot from re-entry. Bulkheads buckled and split as armored warriors forced their way inside. They were giants, space marines, their forms encased in ceramite armor the color of midnight, etched with scripture and battle honors. Each one moved with the weight of centuries, their bolters roaring with explosive fury. They were the Imperium's angels of death, the living embodiment of their god's will. To the faithful, they were invincible. To Kratos, they were merely another obstacle. The first of them entered the command deck, a towering figure, wielding a chainsword the size of a mortal man. His voice boomed through a vox grill, demanding surrender in a tongue Kratos could not understand. The mortals fell silent, trembling. Some dropped to their knees, weeping in terror. The Marine's bolter swept the room, ready to enact the Emperor's justice upon all who stood before him. Kratos stepped forward. The Marine hesitated for a fraction of a heartbeat, his visor locking onto the strange warrior who moved with no fear, no reverence. Then he fired. The bolt round screamed through the air, its mass-reactive core designed to obliterate anything it struck. Kratos twisted aside, the round grazing his shoulder and exploding against the wall behind him. The blast seared his flesh, but he did not slow. He surged forward, his chains whirling. The Marine brought his chain sword down in a sweeping arc. Kratos met it mid-strike, the blades of chaos sparking as they clashed with the roaring teeth of the weapon. For a moment, man and demigod locked in a contest of pure strength. The deck beneath them groaned, metal plates warping under the pressure. Then Kratos drove his knee upward, shattering the Marine's chest plate. With a roar, he tore the chainsword from the warrior's grasp, and buried his own blade through the visor, splitting helm and skull alike. The chamber erupted into chaos. More Marines stormed through the breach, their bolters spitting death. Faithful died in droves, their bodies torn apart by explosive rounds. But their terror turned to fury as they saw Kratos standing unbowed amidst the carnage. They surged forward with crude blades and scavenged rifles, throwing themselves into the fray beside him. The battle became a storm of flesh and metal. Kratos fought like a force of nature, his chains spinning in wide arcs that severed limbs and shattered armor. Bolter fire tore at him, the explosive impacts bruising his flesh and burning his skin. Yet he pressed on, each wound feeding his rage. He moved faster than the armored giants could track, leaping between them, striking from above, dragging them down with sheer, brutal strength.
One Marine, larger than the rest, and bearing a massive power fist, roared a challenge and charged. His strike could have shattered stone, but Kratos caught the blow with both hands. The impact sent a shock wave through the deck, hurling nearby mortals to the ground. Snarling, Kratos twisted, tearing the Marine's arm free at the shoulder. Before the giant could scream, Kratos drove his blades into the gap in his armor, ripping him apart from within. Still they came. For every Marine he felled, another entered, their bolters thundering, their faith unshaken. The faithful were pushed back, their numbers dwindling beneath the relentless assault. Smoke filled the air, thick with the stench of burning oil and flesh. The deck ran slick with blood, human and transhuman alike. Through it all, Kratos did not falter. His body was a map of wounds, his breath ragged, but his fury burned hotter than ever. He remembered the thrones he had shattered, the gods he had slain, the chains he had broken. These warriors fought for an emperor who sat unseen upon a throne of lies. They were his angels of death, his instruments of fear. Kratos would show them what true fear was. With a final, earth-shaking roar, he hurled himself into the heart of their formation. His chains lashed outward, wrapping around the torsos of two Marines. With a single mighty pull, he slammed them together, armor splintering like glass. He wrenched their bodies apart and turned to face the survivors. The remaining Marines hesitated. Even their gene-forged minds could not reconcile what they saw. A lone warrior standing amidst their dead, his weapons glowing like fragments of a fallen star. That hesitation was all Kratos needed. He charged once more, and this time, the Imperium's angels broke before him. When the last bolt round faded and silence fell, Kratos stood alone, among the ruins of the command deck. The faithful gathered slowly, their voices rising in awed whispers. They had seen him fight, not as a mortal, not even as a hero, but as something far greater. Kratos looked upon them, then to the void beyond the viewport. The Imperium had sent its angels, and he had destroyed them. Soon they would send more, greater armies, greater champions. Good, he thought, as his grip tightened on his blades. Let them come. The bodies of the Space Marines still smoldered on the command deck, their ruined armor, leaking smoke and blood that mingled with the shattered remains of machinery. The ship's systems flickered and groaned, damaged beyond repair by the ferocity of the battle. The faithful moved quietly among the dead, their hands trembling as they gathered weapons and stripped armor from their fallen enemies. They did not speak Kratos' name this time, though their eyes were fixed upon him with a mixture of reverence and fear. It was no longer the awe of men who worshipped a savior, but the unease of those who had glimpsed the depths of his wrath. Kratos stood apart, gazing out through the viewport at the drifting wreckage of Imperial vessels. The battle was over, but he knew it was only a prelude. The Imperium would not mistake this defeat for finality. It would return with greater numbers, greater fury. And yet, even as he considered this, there was something in their assault that gnawed at his thoughts. These warriors, these angels of death, they had fought with more than duty. There had been a strange edge to their movements, a hesitation, almost as though they had been uncertain of what they faced. The silence was broken by the ship's auspex system stuttering to life. A series of distorted chimes echoed through the chamber as fragments of intercepted transmissions played through the cracked vox horns. The words were incomprehensible to Kratos, but their tone was unmistakable: urgency, confusion, and one phrase repeated several times, like a curse or a title. It burned itself into the minds of the faithful, causing them to pale and whisper in trembling voices. Kratos turned, his voice low and commanding. "What do they speak of?" One of the braver mortals stepped forward, clutching a dented data slate to his chest. His words tumbled out, halting and broken, but through gestures and crude drawings scratched on the metal floor, Kratos began to understand. The Imperium had mistaken him for something else, not merely a heretic or an invader, but a relic of their own past. A warrior king they had lost long ago, a primarch. The word was alien to Kratos, yet the way it was spoken struck a chord deep within him. It carried weight, like the titles of the gods he had slain, but laced with the ache of memory and reverence. The faithful explained as best they could. The primarchs were beings of myth and history, the emperor's chosen sons, each a creature of impossible might, who had once led vast legions across the stars. They had been heroes, conquerors, and demigods, but they were gone now, scattered and lost, their absence like a wound in the Imperium's soul. The Space Marines who had faced Kratos had seen his strength and believed they were witnessing the return of one such figure. Perhaps they thought him a lost son come home to reclaim his throne. Perhaps they feared him as an impostor, a rival to the Emperor's divine authority. Whatever the truth, their confusion explained their hesitation, and their deaths would only deepen the mystery. Kratos said nothing, but inwardly, a dark amusement stirred. They thought him one of their divine sons, a piece of a broken lineage. In truth, he was something far older, forged in a different realm entirely. He was not their lost son. He was their reckoning. The ship's sensors flared again, displaying a new reading across the fractured consoles. The image was crude but clear enough, a massive vessel approaching, far larger than any that had come before. The faithful recoiled, whispering frantically, this was no simple warship. This was a chapter flagship, a moving citadel bearing warriors beyond count. The icon etched into its hull burned like a brand in the void, a single, immense winged figure, sword raised high. The mortals looked to Kratos, terror etched into their faces. Some begged him to flee, others clung to their weapons with suicidal resolve. Kratos merely tightened his grip on the blades of chaos. The flagship did not open fire immediately. Instead, a single drop pod detached from its belly, streaking through the void like a falling star. It slammed into the battered ship with a sound like a hammer striking an anvil. The impact tore through bulkheads, venting atmosphere into space. When the smoke cleared, a single figure emerged. He was larger than the Space Marines Kratos had fought before, his presence filling the corridor like a living storm. His armor was wrought in gold and crimson, every plate etched with intricate script. A long cloak billowed behind him, tattered but regal. His helmet was crowned with a halo of iron spikes, and in his hands he carried a massive blade that shimmered with crackling energy. The faithful fell to their knees at the sight of him. Their voices broke into panicked prayers, for they knew this was no ordinary warrior. This was a chapter master, one of the highest lords of the Imperium's armies. To them, he was as close to a god as flesh could become. The warrior's helm turned, locking on Kratos. His voice came through the vox, cold and unyielding. Though Kratos could not understand the words, the tone was unmistakable. It was a challenge, a demand for identity, a question carved from suspicion and rage. Kratos answered by stepping forward, his chains rattling, his blades igniting with fire. The chapter master moved with terrifying speed for his size, his great sword arcing down in a blow that could have cleaved a tank in half. Kratos met it head-on, the impact shaking the entire ship. Sparks and fire cascaded around them as they battled in the narrow corridor, their strikes carving deep wounds into the metal walls. Each clash was a contest of equals. The chapter master fought with centuries of skill, his movements precise and relentless. Kratos fought with raw primal fury, every blow fueled by memories of Olympus and the countless thrones he had shattered. Neither yielded an inch. As the duel raged, the faithful watched in silence, too afraid to move. To them, it was more than a battle. It was a vision, a test to see which god would rule them. Finally, with a roar that shook the corridor, Kratos drove his shoulder into the warrior's chest, breaking his stance. In a single fluid motion, he wrapped his chains around the great sword, tore it from the man's grasp, and hurled it aside. The chapter master staggered, falling to one knee. Kratos raised his blades for the killing blow, but as he looked into the warrior's eyes, he saw no fear, only defiance and a question unspoken. The moment stretched, heavy with meaning. Somewhere beyond this duel, beyond this ship, the Imperium itself held its breath, waiting to see if their lost son had returned, or if a new god had come to claim his place. Kratos held his blades aloft, fire licking along their curved edges, as he loomed over the kneeling chapter master. The faithful knelt in breathless silence, their bodies pressed to the blood-slick deck, their voices caught between prayers and screams. Even the surviving Space Marines had stilled, their bolters lowered as they watched this moment unfold. It was not merely a duel between warriors, it was a clash of symbols, a question of faith made manifest. Was Kratos the return of a lost son, or the harbinger of their ruin? The chapter master's helm was cracked, revealing part of his scarred face. His lips curled back in a snarl, and through the damaged vox, his voice roared defiantly. Though Kratos did not understand the words, he felt their meaning, a final rejection of surrender. The warrior spat blood upon the deck, and reached for a dagger at his belt. He would die on his feet, blade in hand, even before this unstoppable foe. Kratos' muscles tensed, ready to end him. But before the strike could fall, the very ship beneath them shuddered violently. A low, guttural sound reverberated through the walls, deeper and more primal than any machine. The lights flickered and died, plunging the corridor into darkness, lit only by the flames of Kratos' weapons and the dim glow of the Marine's armor. The faithful screamed, scattering, their prayers turning to frantic cries. A new sound rose, a chorus of shrieks, so piercing it rattled the bone. The metal bulkheads groaned as something massive struck the ship from without. Kratos looked upward and saw a shape forming in the void beyond the viewport. It was no starship. It was a vast, nightmarish creature, its body a writhing mass of chitin and sinew, studded with barbed limbs and pulsating sacs. Its many jaws opened in unison,
releasing a psychic scream that tore through mortal minds like glass shattering. The Tyranids had returned. Panic swept through the vessel. Bolters roared, mortals fled, and the faithful wept as their fragile courage dissolved. The chapter master surged to his feet, ignoring his wounds, and barked orders to his warriors. Though Kratos could not understand the words, he recognized the command in the man's tone. This was no longer about their duel. The beast outside would destroy them all if they did not fight. The bulkhead ruptured, and a tide of smaller creatures poured through, their talons flashing, their alien shrieks drowning out human screams. The first space marines met them head-on, their bolters blasting apart the initial wave, but more followed, climbing over the corpses of their kin. Acid hissed as it splashed across the deck, eating through armor and flesh alike. The air filled with smoke and the reek of burning. Kratos roared and leapt into the fray, his chains ignited, cutting through the first rank of Tyranids in a single sweeping strike. Their limbs and heads flew in every direction, their bodies collapsing into twitching heat. The sheer momentum of his assault pushed the swarm back for a moment, creating a circle of breathing space around him. The chapter master fought beside him, his massive power sword recovered, and humming with energy. Despite their enmity, they moved like two halves of a single machine. Kratos' wild, brutal strikes complementing the precise, disciplined blows of the Imperium's champion. Together they held the line as the faithful and surviving Marines rallied behind them. Yet even as they fought, the shadow outside the ship grew larger. The great creature was no mere Tyranid beast. It was a synaptic leader, a node in the hive mind's will. Its psychic power poured into the ship, warping reality, bending the weak-willed to madness. Some of the faithful dropped their weapons and clawed at their own faces, their minds broken by the alien presence. Then, with a deafening screech, the creature struck. Its massive claw punched through the ship's hull, tearing away entire sections of the corridor. The vacuum howled, sucking bodies into the void. Kratos anchored himself with his chains, gripping the torn metal with raw strength as he hauled himself forward. The chapter master was caught by the blast and nearly pulled into space, but Kratos seized him at the last moment, dragging him back inside. Their eyes met, and for the first time, there was no hatred between them, only a grim acknowledgement. Enemies or not, they would die together if this creature was not slain. Kratos bellowed a challenge, and charged directly at the beast's massive claw. The chains wrapped around its jagged limb, burning through alien flesh, as he used its own strength to haul himself upward. The monster roared and thrashed, slamming him against the hull, but he clung tighter, climbing higher with each strike of his blades. Acid splashed across his skin, burning deep welts into his flesh. Blood streamed down his arms, but he did not relent. The creature's head emerged, its many jaws snapping at him. Kratos roared back, driving both blades deep into its gaping maw. The heat of the weapons burned through bone and sinew, sending a cascade of ichor raining across the battlefield. The Tyranid thrashed violently, slamming against the ship so hard that entire compartments collapsed. The chapter master saw his chance. Rallying his remaining warriors, he directed their fire at the creature's exposed wound. Bolters thundered, missiles screamed, and the combined assault began to stagger the monstrosity. It shrieked one final time, a sound so piercing, it shattered the ship's remaining viewports, then went still. Its massive body drifted away into the void, dissolving into pieces as the ship's artificial gravity reasserted itself. Silence fell, broken only by the hiss of failing systems and the ragged breaths of the survivor. Kratos hung from the ruined hull, his chains embedded deep in the carcass of the beast. Slowly, he pulled himself back inside. His body was a tapestry of burns and cuts, his breath heavy. Blood dripped freely from his wounds, mingling with alien. For the first time since his arrival in this galaxy, Kratos faltered, his vision blurred, his knees buckling beneath him. The faithful gasped as they saw him stumble, their god bleeding before their eyes. The chapter master, though grievously wounded, stood over him, his voice cold and steady. The words were foreign, but their weight was clear. Even gods can fall. Kratos looked up at him, his teeth bared, rage burning through the haze of pain. He pushed himself to his feet, swaying but unbroken. The faithful began to chant again, louder than before, not because they believed he was invincible, but because they had seen him bleed and still rise. To them, this was not weakness, it was proof that he was real, flesh and fury, not some distant, untouchable deity. Kratos gripped his blades, their fire flickering weakly. His voice was a low growl, barely audible above the chants, but it carried a promise of endless war. "Then, let them come," he said, and somewhere deep within the warp, the ruinous powers stirred, their laughter mingling with the echo of his defiance. Even gods could bleed, and bleed he would, until the galaxy itself drowned in the blood of kings and tyrants. The void was silent once more, the carcass of the tyrannid beast, drifting into darkness, but the silence was not peace. It was the breath drawn before the next storm. A moment stretched thin and trembling, the faithful knelt amid the wreckage, their chants low and ragged, their eyes fixed on Kratos. They had seen him bleed, had watched him nearly fall, and for them, that only deepened their devotion. A god who could be wounded was a god who fought alongside them, not above them. Their voices rose, uniting into a single cry that reverberated through the broken corridors, like the beating of a vast heart. Kratos stood at the center of it all, his body torn and scorched. Blood streaked his skin, mingling with alien ichor in the soot of battle. Each breath was fire in his lungs, each movement a battle against his own failing strength. Yet his gaze was unyielding as he looked out over the mortals who now knelt before him. They did not know his past, did not see the ghosts of Olympus and Midgard shadowing his every step. To them, he was the answer to centuries of silent suffering. He was not their lost son, or their emperor's chosen. He was power incarnate, unchanged. The chapter master stood apart, his golden armor cracked and blackened. Though his warriors had been slain, and his cause shattered, defiance still burned in his eyes. He spoke, his voice raw, issuing words that Kratos could not understand, yet through tone and gesture, the meaning was clear. This battle was not finished. There would be more, endless war, until either Kratos fell, or the Imperium broke entirely. His words were a promise, not to Kratos, but to the galaxy itself. Kratos turned away from him without a word. A lifetime of chains and thrones had taught him that words were wind, only action forged destiny. He strode to the shattered viewport, staring into the vast black expanse beyond. The Imperium was not a single enemy to strike down. It was a hydra, with 1,000 heads, each one drinking the blood of the weak. To destroy it, he would need more than rage. He would need to make the galaxy itself burn against its masters. The faithful followed as he descended through the wreckage of the ship. They carried weapons, scavenged from fallen marines, their banners stitched from torn imperial standards, now daubed with crude symbols of rebellion. What had begun as terrified worship had become something sharper, more dangerous. They no longer merely prayed for deliverance. They demanded. Kratos had not asked for their loyalty, but they gave it freely, and in their eyes, he saw the shape of an army forming. When they reached the lower decks, Kratos found the surviving engines humming faintly. The ship was broken, but not dead. With guttural shouts and desperate labor, the mortals repaired what they could, patching hulls with scavenged steel, rewiring conduits with bare hands. It would never again match the Imperium's might, but it would fly, and it would carry their wrath to the stars. Kratos watched them work, his mind turning. This vessel was no longer a prison, or a relic of their false god. It was a weapon. As the ship stirred to life, Vox signals flickered across the remaining consoles. Fragmented voices filled the air, each carrying news of distant worlds. Kratos listened as the faithful translated in halting whispers. Across countless planets, the Imperium ground mortals beneath its heel. In some places, famine and plague claimed more lives than war. In others, the shadow of chaos loomed, cults rising to challenge imperial rule, with their own twisted worship. Everywhere, there was suffering. Everywhere, There were chains. Kratos felt the old rage stirring deep within his chest. It was the same fury that had driven him to destroy Olympus, to tear down the gods, who had bound his life to their whims. He would not be a savior. He would not replace one throne with another. He would burn them all. He turned to the faithful, his voice carrying like thunder through the chamber. They could not understand the words, but they felt the promise in his tone. He pointed outward, toward the stars, then to the Imperium's banners that still hung tattered from the walls. Finally, he struck his blades together, sparks flying in the dark. The meaning was unmistakable. War, not a war of armies or thrones, but a war to end all rulers, all masters. The faithful roared in answer. Their chant was no longer a prayer, it was a declaration. The ship rose from the corpse-strewn battlefield and plunged into the void. With each passing system, more flocked to Kratos' banner. Some were deserters from the Imperial Guard, their faith in the Emperor shattered. Others were freed slaves, cultists fleeing chaos warlords, or Xenos driven to desperation by Imperial conquest. They came not because they loved him, but because he gave them something greater than survival: vengeance. The Imperium called it heresy, Chaos called it madness, the galaxy called it impossible, Kratos called it necessity. Each world they struck became another spark in the spreading blaze. Governors were dragged from their palaces and cast down before the masses. Imperial temples were toppled, their statues shattered, and left to smolder in the streets. Kratos led every assault personally, his chains carving paths through armies that had once believed themselves invincible. The faithful fought like zealots, their belief in their living god unshaken. But Kratos fought alone, even in the heart of his growing army. The stories spread faster than the truth. Some called him a returned Primarch, others, a god of old reborn. The Imperiums, inquisitors, argued in their shadowed chambers, unsure whether to destroy him or claim him. Chaos warlords sent emissaries bearing promises of power, only to have their heads returned as silent refusals. Kratos accepted no allies, no chains. As the crusade spread, entire sectors began to burn. For every world freed, 3 more rose in revolt. For every loyalist army crushed, another appeared from the darkness to take its place. The Imperium reeled, struggling to contain the wildfire. The High Lords, on terror, spoke his name in dread, their voices hushed. Kratos stood at the center of it all, not upon a throne, but at the front lines. On one world, he faced a planetary governor, who had ordered the execution of thousands to maintain control. The man knelt before him, begging for mercy, his gilded robe soaked in sweat. Kratos raised his blade, and for an instant, the crowd believed he might show clemency. He did not. The strike was swift, merciless. The crowd erupted into roars of fury and exultation, the image of their tyrant's head falling etched into their hearts forever. In that moment, Kratos understood what he had become. Not a ruler, not a savior, he was a fire, consuming everything false and rotten. His crusade was not built on faith, but on destruction, and like all fires, it would spread until nothing remained but ash and silence. He turned from the burning city, his gaze fixed on the distant stars. Somewhere beyond them, he knew, the Imperium's true power waited, and he would meet it, alone if he must, with blades ready and chains unbound. The Crusade of One had begun, and the galaxy would tremble beneath its shadow. The fires of rebellion spread like veins of molten gold across the stars. Worlds burned, their skies lit by the glow of uprising and vengeance. Imperial temples crumbled, statues of the Emperor toppled and shattered by hands that had once trembled in prayer. Kratos' crusade had become a storm that no edict could halt, and no army could fully contain. Across entire sectors, loyalist fleets were drawn into battles they could not win, while chaos warlords circled like carrion birds, seeking to claim fragments of his growing legend for themselves. But Kratos did not see himself as they did. To his followers, he was a god. To his enemies, a heretic or a weapon of ruin. To Kratos himself he was neither. He was destruction given form, a blade cutting through chains that had been forged over millennia. The galaxy would not be remade under his rule. It would be broken so utterly that no throne could ever rise again. Yet, as his forces grew, so too did the whispers. They began as faint echoes, fragments of sound at the edge of perception. At first, Kratos thought them remnants of the warp storms he had encountered, the background noise of a realm, forever teetering between madness and silence. But the voices persisted, growing sharper, more distinct. They did not come from the mortals around him, or the warp-touched cults he had crushed. They came from within the very fabric of the galaxy, threading through the void like veins of living light. One night, if such things could be measured in the endless dark between stars, Kratos stood alone on the bridge of his vessel. The void stretched before him, an infinite ocean of black scattered with cold, distant fire. His army slept, or prayed far below, the faithful, locked in dreams of the battles to come. Kratos did not dream. He watched and waited, listening to the silence between the stars. And then the silence broke. The voice was not a sound but a presence, filling the chamber as though the very air had turned to iron. It was vast, immeasurable, like the weight of a mountain pressing down upon a single mortal heart. It spoke not in words, but in impressions, each thought carrying meaning so profound it threatened to crush the mind that received it. Kratos staggered, his hands clenching his chains, until the links dug deep into his skin. He had heard the voices of gods before, Ares, Zeus, Odin. But this was different. Those had been tyrants shouting from lofty thrones.
This was a whisper, intimate and terrible, spoken as though directly into his soul. "You are far from home, warrior." Kratos' teeth bared, his breath ragged. "Who speaks?" His voice was a growl, raw and defiant. "I am the last light of mankind," the presence intoned, each concept unfurling like a blade through his mind. "I am the will that endures when all others falter. I am the Emperor." The title was meaningless to Kratos, yet the weight behind it was unmistakable. It was the name spoken in prayers and curses across every world he had seen, the unseen ruler of this vast decaying empire, a corpse god who ruled through faith and silence. Kratos' rage flared. Another throne, another master who claims dominion over mortals. "I have shattered such thrones before." The whisper did not rise in anger, it remained calm, almost mournful. "I do not rule as you believe. I do not live as you understand. I am bound, sustained by sacrifice and will alone. The Imperium is my shadow, twisted by those who came after. I would see it endure, yet it devours itself." Kratos' chains rattled as his fists clenched. "Your shadow enslaves the galaxy. It burns worlds in your name. It bends the weak until they break. And you," the Emperor's voice murmured, "have become its greatest threat." The words hung between them, heavy and cold. Kratos felt no pride at the accusation, only a deeper anger. "I am no servant of your Imperium. I seek only to destroy it, so none may rule again." The whisper shifted, almost like a sigh. "There will always be rulers, warrior. If you tear down the Imperium, chaos will rise to claim the ashes. If you burn the thrones of mortals, demons will build new ones from the bones. You have seen this in your own world. Destruction is never enough. There must be something left to guide the living." Kratos snarled, "I am no guide. I am no god." "You are power," the Emperor replied, his tone sharpened now. "And power will always be claimed by those willing to wield it. Better that it be guided than left to fester." The whisper grew stronger, wrapping around Kratos like chains made of thought and memory. Images flooded his mind, vast armies kneeling in perfect order, cities rebuilt from ruin, a galaxy unified beneath a single, unyielding will. At the center of it all stood a figure that was not the Emperor but Kratos himself. His blades raised, his chains no longer symbols of oppression but of dominion. "Serve me," the Emperor's whisper urged. "Lead them. You can destroy the false rulers and take their place. Together, we can forge a galaxy free from chaos, free from endless war." For a moment the vision stirred something deep within Kratos, a memory of the brief, fragile peace he had once tried to build after Olympus fell. a world where his son might have lived without fear. The thought cut deeper than any blade. But then he saw beyond it, the kneeling masses, the worship in their eyes, the same cycle repeating, only with a different name carved into the throne. His name. No. The word was low, final. The vision shattered like glass. The Emperor's whisper sharpened, its calm replaced by a cold fury. You refuse Valation, you doom them all. Kratos' voice thundered through the empty bridge. I will not be your weapon, I will not be your heir. I will not trade one tyranny for another. The presence recoiled, the void trembling as though the stars themselves flinched. For an instant, Kratos thought he saw a figure at the edge of his vision. A skeletal form bound to a throne of gold, its hollow eyes burning with desperate fire. Then it was gone, leaving only silence. Kratos stood alone once more, his breath ragged, his heart pounding like a war drum. The chains at his wrists dripped blood where they had bitten into his skin. The faithful stirred below, sensing something vast and terrible had passed among them. Kratos looked to the stars, his decision clear. The Emperor had offered him dominion. He had answered with defiance. Now there would be no middle path, no parley or truce. This was no longer a rebellion, it was a war between two gods, one bound to a throne, the other free to burn the galaxy to its knees. The whisper faded, but its echo lingered like smoke clinging to burned flesh. Kratos stood alone upon the command deck, the void stretched before him, endless and cold. His breath was slow, controlled, yet his blood boiled with a rage deeper than any battle he had fought. The Emperor had offered him a throne, a galaxy of kneeling souls bound beneath his chains. For a heartbeat, the vision had tempted him, stirring memories of a son, long gone, of a peace that had always been just out of reach. But he had shattered it with a single word. Now there was no peace, no turning back. The galaxy itself would have to be broken, because if it endured, so too would the thrones and the chains. The war began not with a single battle, but with 1,000 fires lit at once. Loyalist worlds rose up in revolt as the stories of Kratos spread like a contagion. His name became a weapon whispered in dark alleys and shouted across burning streets. Some called him the returned Primarch, the son the Emperor had hidden away. Others declared him a god risen from the ashes to judge the Imperium. Neither truth nor lie mattered. What mattered was fear. The Imperium faltered, its armies stretched thin, its faith shaken. Kratos moved through it all like a storm given flame. His crusade swept from one world to the next, leaving nothing but ruin in its wake. Cities were toppled, orbital stations seized, imperial palaces cast down to rubble. He did not sit in council or plan from afar. Wherever the fighting was fiercest, he was there, his chains and blades carving through the enemy with unstoppable force. His presence alone was enough to turn hopeless battles into victory. The faithful followed him not because they loved him, but because they saw in his defiance the promise of their own liberation. But as his rebellion grew, so did the forces arrayed against him. The High Lords of Terror could no longer ignore the spreading fire. Fleets were pulled from distant crusades, entire chapters of space marines, recalled to crush the uprising. Inquisitors gathered in shadowed chambers, whispering of ancient prophecies and forbidden truth. Some believed Kratos to be a fragment of the Emperor's lost design, a weapon unleashed by the warp itself. Others saw only a heretic, whose destruction would restore their dominion. Their disagreements ended when the first of the traitor legions emerged. Chaos had been watching, waiting. Now, as the Imperium reeled, the servants of the dark gods struck. Warbands poured forth from the Eye of Terror, their ships black with sigils of blood and madness. They descended upon Kratos' worlds, not as allies but as scavengers, seeking to claim the ruins for themselves. The galaxy convulsed. Loyalist and heretic clashed not only with Kratos' forces, but with each other. Battles raged on a scale so vast, even the most ancient wars of his home world seemed like skirmishes in comparison. Whole sectors vanished beneath the shadow of fleet engagements, planets burned to lifeless cinders by the fury of extermination. And still, Kratos, on the world of Drevak Prime, he faced 3 armies at once, Imperial Guard regiments entrenched in their cathedral fortresses, Chaos warbands howling praises to their dark patrons, and his own faithful charging across the ash wastes, with scavenged weapons. The air was thick with promethium smoke and the screams of the dying. Titans strode across the horizon, their footfalls shaking mountains to rubble. At the battle's height, a greater daemon emerged from the warp, its towering form blotting out the sun. Kratos met it alone. Their clash was cataclysmic. The daemon's claws tore craters into the earth, its voice a chorus of 1,000 damned souls. Kratos' blades blazed like twin suns, each strike carving through unnatural flesh. The ground trembled beneath them, armies scattering like insects before a storm. When at last he severed the creature's head and raised it high for all to see, both mortal and daemon fell silent. Even the forces of chaos faltered, unsure whether they faced a rival god or a new master. But victory brought no respite. No sooner had Drevak Prime fallen than new enemies emerged. The tyrannid swarm returned, drawn by the carnage. Orc warbands, sensing the greatest battle in millennia, descended in roaring hordes. Necron tomb worlds stirred, their silent legions marching to reclaim ancient dominions. The galaxy itself seemed to awaken, each faction drawn into the maelstrom. Through it all, Kratos remained unbent. His crusade no longer sought merely to topple the Imperium. Now, it burned against everything that claimed dominion, whether in the name of gods, men, or monsters. Worlds became battlefields, battlefields became graveyards, and graveyards became legends. In the halls of terror, the Emperor's mortal servants trembled. The Astronomicon flickered, its psychic beacon threatened by the warp storms unleashed by the endless war. Astropaths screamed prophecies of doom, their voices silenced by bolt of fire. As swiftly as they spoke, the High Lords turned to desperate measures. Entire sectors were declared lost, their populations condemned to exterminatus, rather than allowed to fall into Kratos' hands. Yet even this did not halt him. Each act of imperial cruelty only fed the fires of rebellion. The more the Imperium tightened its grip, the more worlds slipped through its fingers. Chaos too began to fracture, its warlords unable to decide whether to destroy Kratos or worship him. Some declared him an avatar of Khorne, the god of bloodshed. Others spat curses, seeing in him a rival whose fury threatened their own ascendance. Amidst this storm of shifting alliances and broken oaths, Kratos pushed ever forward. His forces were a patchwork of species and creeds, united by nothing but their hatred of chains. They did not march in perfect ranks or chant the same prayers. They fought because he fought, because his rage lit a fire they could not extinguish. On the edge of the segmentum solar, where the stars burned brighter and the shadows of terror itself loomed, Kratos' fleet assembled for the final push. Before them lay the heart of the Imperium, defended by the greatest armada humanity had ever mustered. Battle barges, cathedral ships, and fortress monoliths filled the void, their cannons bristling like the teeth of some ancient beast. Kratos stood upon the prow of his flagship, the faithful chanting behind him. He did not look back at them. His gaze was fixed on the golden light that marked the distant Astronomicon, the throne world where the corpse god whispered from his silent seat. The voice came again, faint and cold. Turn back, it urged. End this now, before all is lost. Kratos bared his teeth. All was lost, long before I came. The fleet surged forward, the void erupted into fire. Titans of steel and will clashed amidst the stars as the war to end the galaxy began. And at the forefront of it all, Kratos hurled himself into the heart of the storm, his chains ready to shatter the last throne that dared to stand against him. The void burned. Kratos' fleet clashed with the Imperium's armada in a storm of fire and ruin. The stars themselves seemed to vanish beneath the blaze of macro-cannon salvos and lance strikes. Cathedral ships shattered into drifting tombs, their sacred spires spinning through the blackness. Fortress monoliths groaned as their adamantium hulls split apart, spilling thousands of defenders into the cold abyss. Vox horns blared hymns of defiance, their holy verses drowned beneath the roar of battle and the screams of dying world. At the center of the chaos, Kratos' flagship carved a path through the void like an axe through bone. Its patched hull bore no sigils of loyalty, no banners of faith, only scars from 1,000 battles, each mark a testament to defiance. On its prow, Kratos stood unyielding, his silhouette framed by the fires of the dying fleet.
His chains rattled softly in the cold air, their familiar weight a promise of finality. Behind him, the faithful chanted, their voices rising in a single unstoppable rhythm. They did not sing to worship him, not anymore. They sang to declare to the galaxy that no master could ever rise again. The Imperium's fleet closed around them, a tightening noose of steel and faith. Space Marine strike cruisers descended in disciplined formations, their engines glowing like twin suns. At their core, a single vessel gleamed brighter than the rest, a colossal warship, whose hull was layered with gold and black, its prow carved into the visage of a stern, faceless emperor. It was the will of Terra made manifest, the final line, before the throne world itself. From this vessel came the Imperium's champions. Drop pods slammed into Kratos' flagship, their hatches bursting open to unleash towering warriors clad in ceramite and scripture. Entire squads of Space Marines surged forth, their bolters spitting explosive death. Behind them marched towering custodians, the Emperor's personal guard, their halberds glowing with righteous fire. The faithful died in droves. Their crude rifles and scavenged blades were no match for the Imperium's finest, but they did not falter. They threw themselves into the fray with suicidal resolve, buying Kratos the time he needed to push toward the heart of the battle. He moved through the slaughter like a living tempest. Chains whirled, blades ignited, each strike cutting a crimson path through the Imperium's mightiest warriors. Bolter rounds struck his flesh, tearing gouges into his skin. But he did not slow. A custodian lunged, his halberd aimed at Kratos' heart. Kratos caught the weapon mid-strike and wrenched it free, snapping its shaft with a single twist, before driving his blade through the warrior's golden helm. Blood hissed against the burning edge, and the custodian fell. The battlefield became a storm of fire and scream. Space Marines chanted litanies of war as they died beneath Kratos' fury. Custodians locked in combat with him found themselves outmatched, their perfect forms crumbling beneath his relentless strength. Every step Kratos took drove him closer to the central corridor that led to the enemy's command sanctum. His faithful followed where they could, their voices ragged, their bodies broken, but their will unshaken. At last, the great doors to the sanctum loomed before him. Carved from black stone veined with gold, they were covered in endless script, each word a prayer, each line a commandment of obedience. Kratos stared at them and saw only chains. With a roar that shook the vessel's bones, he hurled himself forward. His blade struck once, twice, thrice, and the doors split apart like rotten wood. Beyond lay the heart of the Imperium's fleet, a vast chamber stretched before him, its walls lined with relics of ancient wars. At its center stood a dais upon which a single figure waited. The man's armor was wrought of gold and silver, his cloak of crimson velvet. His face was hidden behind a helm shaped like a death mask, its hollow eyes glowing faintly. In his hands he held a weapon unlike any Kratos had ever seen, a sword of pure psychic fire, its blade humming with restrained power. The figure spoke, his voice amplified through the chamber. Though Kratos could not understand the words, he knew their meaning. This was no mere warrior. This was a Lord Commander, a master of fleets and legions, sent by Terra itself to stop him. They circled one another, the world falling silent around them. The faithful dared not breathe. Even the distant roar of the fleet seemed to fade. Then, without warning, the Lord Commander struck. His blade carved a line of fire through the air, the psychic energy lashing outward like a whip. Kratos leapt aside, the heat searing his skin, and countered with a sweep of his chains. The two forces met in a clash that sent shockwaves rippling through the chamber. Their battle was a symphony of violence. The Lord Commander moved with precision and grace, each strike guided by centuries of training and psychic mastery. Kratos fought with raw, unbridled fury, his every blow a declaration of defiance. The chamber shook beneath their struggle, relics shattering, statues crumbling to dust. The Lord Commander's blade bit deep into Kratos' side, spilling blood across the floor. Pain flared, sharp and white-hot, but Kratos roared and pressed forward, his blades hammering against the psychic weapon. Each clash tore at reality itself, sparks of warp lightning dancing through the air. Finally, the Lord Commander faltered. Kratos seized the moment, wrapping his chains around the man's sword arm. With a wrenching pull, he tore the weapon free and hurled it across the chamber. The Lord Commander stumbled to his knees. Kratos loomed over him, his own breath ragged, his body a tapestry of wounds. The man spoke again, his tone no longer commanding, but desperate. Kratos did not understand his words, but he understood their shape. Pleas for mercy, promises of surrender, justifications for a lifetime of tyranny. Kratos' voice was a low growl. I have heard such words before. With a final merciless strike, he split the Lord Commander's helm and skull in two. The chamber fell silent. The faithful erupted into a cry so loud it seemed to shake the stars. They surged forward, tearing down the relics and banners of the Imperium, replacing them with their crude symbols of rebellion. The walls ran red with the blood of the old order, but Kratos did not join them. He turned and walked to the viewport at the chamber's end. Beyond it, the throne world of Terra gleamed in the distance, its surface a sea of golden light. The Astronomican's psychic beacon burned like a sun, guiding the Imperium's fleets across the galaxy. It was beautiful in its own way, beautiful and utterly false. The voice returned, faint but cutting. Turn back, there is still time. Kratos' jaw tightened. There is no time left, only the end. He raised his blades high. The faithful fell silent, their eyes locked on him. Slowly, Kratos crossed the chains and slammed them down upon the deck. The sound echoed like a war drum, across the chamber, across the ship, across the entire fleet. No words were needed. The fleet surged forward, terror growing larger with every heartbeat. The final battle loomed. The galaxy itself seemed to tremble, caught between annihilation and rebirth. Kratos stood at the forefront, not as a king, not as a savior, but as the one truth the galaxy had denied for too long. A god, not of thrones, but of war. And when the last blow fell, only silence would remain.